Greetings and salutations. Finally, the weekend is here, Hawk Watchers, and while the cable news media continues to discover that children in U.S. proxy wars actually do get hurt, shocking, I know. Psst, hey, Kate, maybe next time you won't have to wait for a perfectly shot video to enter your feed before recognizing the horrors of war that CNN kind of advocates for and helps the Pentagon promote from time to time. Just saying. Yeah. There was actually a major bit of good news that hit the newsstands and airwaves this week, as Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates in the U.S. Department of Justice announced that it will finally be ending its use of private prisons. Yes, you heard me correctly. The United States, home to the world's largest prison population, which according to the International Center for Prison Studies currently stands at well over 2 million inmates, but remember, we're the land of the free, will no longer be doing business with for-profit prisons. At least not on the federal level. Now, the corporate-run prisons will still be able to sign deals at the state level and with ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, just not with the feds anymore. In a memo released Thursday, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates explained they simply do not provide the same level of correctional services, programs, and resources. They do not save substantially on costs. And as noted in a recent report by the department's Office of Inspector General, they do not maintain the same level of safety and security. I wonder, do you think we are finally seeing the cups of change crash upon the bars of our criminal justice system? Well, let's yell Attica and find out as we start watching the Hawks.
If you want to know what's going on in your city, in your streets, never back down like Tyrel, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabetha Wallace with the wisdom and the pearl. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world? Watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks. Listen when they talk.
Welcome everybody to Watching the Hawks. I am Tyrel Ventura.
And I am Tabetha Wallace.
Sean Stone.
All right, joining us today in Watching the Hawks is daily caller reporter JulieGrace Brufke, always a pleasure, and political strategist, bipartisan lobbyist, and founder of the Caldwell Strategic Consulting, Gianno Caldwell.
Glad to be here.
Man, it's always a pleasure to have you guys on, returning champions, as always. All right, let's kick things off with the private prisons on the way out on the federal level. So what do we think? Is this the start of an actual real push to reform the prison industrial complex, or is this just kind of that, post-presidential legacy building out of the Obama administration in its final months? I mean, is this real or is this, what is this?
If I may, I think that this is part of that legacy push. I'm very thankful to see what the president has done here. But we got to understand, how did this mass incarceration start? How did this kind of culture start? And I think back to the 1994 crime bill, in which Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, they were champions of. This bill provided $8.7 billion for the building of prisons. It led to the mass incarceration of African Americans, which we now call modern-day slavery. It took money out for those that wanted to get training before exiting, educated, leading to a recidivism rate of 75% after 5 years. This bill did a lot of damage, and it has now caused the federal government has been spending about $700 million a year for these private prisons. So I'm glad to see President Obama has chosen
I
to
think
do this.
both sides of the aisle agree that there's a lot of issues with franchise. But honestly, I don't think this is going to make that big of a difference. Most of the for-profit prisons are on the state level. I think only 13 of the federal prisons out of, 122 are private. So I think that it's more of a political move than anything. Sure, a step in the right direction, but do I think it's going to make that big of a difference? No.
It's interesting because really, when you look at Obama's legacy with the for-profit prison series, actually it falls more in the immigration areas, in dealing with the folks coming up from South America and from Latin America. Those facilities between 2005 and 2014 jumped 37%, from 25% to 62%. That's a massive number jump when you're dealing with that. I mean, anybody in the group, any ideas in terms of how to deal with immigration? I mean, they're using that still. ICE isn't giving it up. Is that going to change at all in the future, or are we going to stick with that?
No. I mean, this is the thing with this is that, yeah, immigration is where all of this money is going into. I just don't know. I mean, I have on a personal level, I don't think you should profit from prisons or incarcerating people. Right. That's a personal thing, because I think it's exactly what's happened on the federal level you see in private prisons is what happening is it's not cost efficient because there's a profit in it. So you're not going to do the best job with what you have. You're going to try to make as much money as you can.
Right.
And ultimately, the customer, being the state and taxpayers, aren't getting what they paid for.
Right.
And if it was a little bit different, I might, you know, like you said, if it had training, if we were doing something and it was being productive, then maybe I'd say, okay, then it's all right, but they're not. This, like you were saying, I mean, this is 22,000 out of 2 million people that won't be in these prisons. I mean, should this be carried over to the state level and places like ICE, where we need something, but putting in the hands of private?
That's a really good question, but I think the carryover, what we know as the truth in sentencing laws that was passed via that 94 crime bill, has led to a lot of these folks being incarcerated at the state level. So the truth in sentencing laws, there was grant money provided through the 94 crime bill, which allowed for states who enacted these laws, and you had to be in 85% of the time, it was a reoccurring effect. So whereas we look at it as political to a degree, if people see that there's some positivity out of this, comes out of it, then perhaps there will be some states that say, okay, we're gonna shut some of these institutions down, but that's kind of being hopeful at this point. Who knows if that's gonna actually happen?
I mean, I'm usually a huge defender of the private sector with free markets, but I mean, obviously this isn't working. There's been multiple reports out there. There have been a ton of issues. It's not cost effective. So, I mean, I think it'll depend on the administration, and I'm usually also very anti-regulation, but if they are going to stick with private prisons, obviously something needs to be done to make sure that they're running efficiently.
Yeah, and the stocks on private prison companies or these private companies tanked today.
Went down, what, 40%?
Oof.
Yeah, that's
it was
a
a
lot.
monstrous drop.
I mean, I think that's going to
people
rally due to the fact that states and local are still using these contracts. I think that's temporary.
I could see private companies playing a role in prisons in the sense of actually more towards education purposes. If you wanted to actually have reform, which is what the prison system actually should be oriented towards, as opposed to punishment and being punitive, you'd want to see maybe more of prisoner education programs, basically GEDs, things that can actually help the prisoners. So when they're actually out of the prison system, they'll have economic opportunities available to them. So towards that end, I could see private companies having a role in prisons. But again, the idea of profiting from incarcerating people, and as we've seen this jump from 1980, there were 300,000 prisoners in this country. We're over at 2 million now. You say 94, I see 1980s with the drug laws was the really beginning of this push to really start mass incarcerating people.
But after the 94 crime bill,
it got worse.
40%.
It got worse. It got worse. Three strikes bill, even worse. I mean, these things are just incremental problems. But it's at the end of the day, it goes back to, I think, this overall war on drugs culture. So you're really just punishing people most of the time for being I would say non-violent criminals. Most of the time, you're punishing in this case.
Well, and then you saw in certain situations, I think it was in the East Coast, where you saw judges being influenced by the private prison industry to put juveniles in jail, and actually had to go to jail for putting juveniles in jail when they shouldn't have been put in jail.
For not much time at all.
Exactly. So, all right, let's move over now. You guys are both coming from the right side at times. So Charlie Sykes, the Milwaukee radio host, recently made a statement saying that Trump is a monster. He said this because he views the conservative media has created an environment in which people are led to distrust all forms of media, like talk show hosts, things like that. Do you think that right-wing media has been a little too abrasive for too long in kind of leading people to discredit actual credible media sources in the kind of quote-unquote liberal media that's going after right-wing? Has it kind of made it to where now you can't produce any facts in an argument?
I mean, I obviously work for right-wing media. I don't think all right-wing media can be treated equally. I feel like what we've seen with Breitbart recently is very different than I know how things are run at the Daily Caller where I work. I think Fox News has some great reporters. I mean, Trump's definitely got I think the mainstream media and conservative media have contributed to Trump getting,
downfall.
I mean, he was going to get media attention regardless of he's a media machine.
Right.
I think what Sykes is kind of getting to is that idea that, like, if I bring up anything that is counter-narrative now to the top guy, like whether it's Trump saying it or whatever, and then the followers say, oh, it must be true. If I bring up any kind of counter-narrative and say, well, actually the New York Times for an example, said this didn't work, or RT, for example, said this didn't, it's immediately that I'm like a sellout and everything else to that crowd. Do
you know, what's interesting to me, and to your earlier point in terms of discrediting, I would say that some of these media outlets actually discredit themselves, because if you look at some networks, I really don't want to say the name, but I'm going to have to say it to give people an example. If you turn on CNN and there's a pro-Trump person on the panel, no matter what that pro-Trump person says, the host is going to shut them down each and every time. And that's the times that I view. I do mostly Fox. But when I see that, I'm wondering, like, wow, won't you give them an opportunity to hear what they have to say and at least be fair? You have to have a fair dialogue when talking about these issues. 99% of the time, neither candidate is going to be 100% correct, whether it be Hillary Clinton people or Donald Trump people. But it seems as though Donald Trump isn't getting a fair shot from the media when you look at it. It's only like Fox News that allow for at least a fair and balanced argument by bringing in Democrats, Republicans, and letting them hash it out, and then you take away what you want to take away from it.
Ooh, Fox News, fair and balanced, really?
I've never heard that before. That's weird. They should use that. Yeah, what do you
I mean, I love Fox. I was a Fox News intern for a long time. I think they have done a good job of giving time to allow both sides to kind of explain their arguments.
I think that's when it counts, yeah.
I think CNN's, I think this election is a unique.
Well, I think
it's a bizarre election. I think it's a bizarre election, and everybody really,
yeah.
I mean, if you just look at anyone looks at their Facebook feed, I think this has been the most divisive boxing match of an election, and it's literally turned everybody. It's like, I didn't know I hated everything you stood for until I saw that one Facebook post, and and it seems to work. So hopefully, if we can get through the next, 90 some odd days, and we can get through it.
Gianno, Caldwell, JulieGrace, Brufke, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for giving us your perspective today. All right, as we go to break, Hawk Watchers, don't forget to let us know what you think of the topics we've covered on Facebook and Twitter. See our full shows at RT.com, and for exclusive behind-the-scenes Hawks coverage, download the app RT plugin, which is available on iTunes and Google Play. Coming up, journalist David Farrier enters the Hawks Nest to discuss his new documentary film, Tickled, where he enters the dark and rather insidious world of competitive tickling. Seriously, it's a thing, and it actually is really disturbing. Stay tuned to Watching the Hawks.
Let's defeat her.
A man you can bait with a tweet is not a man we can trust with nuclear weapons.
She's their puppet, and they pull the strings.
We will not ban a religion.
We don't want them in our country.
We will not build a wall.
A great border wall, believe me. USA, USA.
I am 8 generations removed from slavery.
Washington, Ashley Banks, RT.
Some say all lives matter, but do they really?
African Americans remain oppressed and locked
If Black Lives Matter, wouldn't Black history be on display for the world to see?
Fundamental problems facing the Black population.
I'm hoping for the day where all Black people will be seen as humans and not as commodities.
One officer holds a gun. Sterling was fatally shot by Brown was shot and killed.
Boy, ladies and gentlemen, do we have a story to tickle your fancy? Literally. Recently, we interviewed David Farrier from New Zealand, a journalist specializing in, as he calls it, light entertainment. And we interviewed him about his latest film, Tickled. Stumbling through the internet one day, David came upon the world of competitive tickling. But it wasn't the light-hearted affair you might think. What David uncovered was a world of exploited young men lured with the promise of big bucks for what seemed like an innocent video recording of other men fully clothed tickling them. What followed from his very first investigations into the world of tickling were intrigue, threats, and one of the most bizarre stories we've ever heard of. We first asked David when he learned about the world of competitive tickling and whether or not it shocked him at all. You gotta listen to this.
I'm a light entertainment reporter in New Zealand, and I'm always looking for strange stories. And I found this website that was this tickling competition in LA, and once a month they flew in young men from all around the world, and the money was great, you know, thousands of dollars cash, free flights, and all you had to do was take part in this tickling contest. So I was blown away straight away.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Tell me a little bit about the Jane O'Brien Media.
Very mysterious entity that was running these competitions, and very seemed to be a lot of money behind it, because, you know, this competition is huge. And when I reached out saying I'd like to do a story, their very first response was strange, because they said, we don't want to deal with a gay journalist, which was weird because these videos were really homoerotic. You've got these young men tickling each other. Yeah. Then I started blogging about it in New Zealand and writing about these emails, and then they hired an attorney in New York who started sending me letters saying, you know, stop poking around. They hired an attorney in New Zealand to do the same thing. And then they sent 3 men from New York all the way to New Zealand, representatives, to tell us there's no documentary here, and if you make a documentary, you'll be sued into oblivion. And of course, at that point, you go, of course there's more here.
And someone tells you not to look.
Yeah, exactly. And we started filming it.
Well, it's like acting guilty of something, but,
exactly.
but you haven't even asked.
And I mean, we were in New Zealand. I made this film with my friend Dylan. We were in New Zealand, and suddenly they're almost like flying the subjects to us. So of course we're going to start filming.
Right.
And so, you know, from there we took off to America and sort of traveled around the United States, just trying to find out who was behind this. And we also noticed that a lot of the young men in the videos, they were subject to this huge online harassment campaign, much like we were. So we were just trying to find out what was happening.
So it's interesting, your harassment seems to be kind of a part of a bigger phenomenon of bullying within the world of competitive tickling.
Yeah, it's weird you're even saying this, right?
Yeah, it feels weird.
Yeah, I feel sometimes like talking about this like I'm going crazy, because like, how does this even exist? But yeah, believe it or not, you know, these tickling videos, this tickling competition happens. A lot of these videos end up on the internet, and they're used and contextualized in a way that is used to harass the people in the video. So suddenly these videos are all over the internet. And they're in your employer's inbox, they're going to your grandmother, your girlfriend, and you know, it's sort of, they use in a way to manipulate people and kind of tear these people's lives apart. And the money gets crazy. You know, we thought it was $1,500 for a shoot. Suddenly people are getting paid $12,000 upwards. Wow. So the money was crazy, and the intimidation towards us got more intense. And yeah, I mean, the film goes to some pretty strange places, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's less about tickling and more about power and control and manipulation.
So let me just ask you, who is bullying who? Because I think that's where the part that becomes sort of hard to understand. You think, okay, here's these young men who are going and making these videos, getting paid $12,000. Somebody was like, hey, 12 grand, all you gotta do is get tickled. I'm like, that seems fine. So who is it ultimately, without giving too much away, who's bullying who? Like, who's harassing who?
Yeah, completely. I mean, some of these young men, they go and they're tickled, and you're right, it's easy money, and they're in and they're out, and they've made $20,000. Great. The problem is when you annoy the organizer. Maybe you don't want to tickle anymore, or maybe you say something that offends them in an email. Then suddenly you're being harassed to a sort of an insane level. When we looked into it, what we found is that this behavior wasn't new. This had been happening for over 20 years. And it all led back to one individual. And this individual, you know, has caused us a lot of problems now because, you know, they didn't want a film made about them. They've been very secretive for 20 years. And the fact the film is out is like their nightmare. So, you know, we're now being threatened. I mean, there's been 2 defamation suits against the film already. The main subject turned up to our LA premiere and threatened us live with more lawsuits in front of an entire audience. So this whole, you know, while we'll finish the film, it almost feels like this whole experience just keeps going as we release it in America.
Wow. Now, what's interesting, too, is you talked a lot about the manipulation, you know, of these young men, and that at one point even the FBI got involved.
They did.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we found this character. We were dealing with Jane O'Brien. We found this other character, Terry DeSisto, who had been active in the 90s. And what she would do, she would get in touch with, this was, the early days of the internet. She'd get in touch with people on music forums on the internet and Usenet groups. And she would say, hey, I'm a college student and I love tickling and I'm doing like a tickling thesis. How would you like me to FedEx you $1,000 to your dorm? Just make some tickling videos with your roommates. When those people stopped making those videos for whatever reason, saying, oh, my girlfriend's, not too into this anymore, I kind of want to stop. Suddenly, they were being set up for email bombing everything from their university servers to the White House. And so the FBI got involved to find out why these students were taking these networks down. And then they found out that it's not the students doing it, it's this Terry DeSisto character. And then they end up finding out who Terry DeSisto is. Wow. And lo and behold, it's the same person that we are dealing with, 13, 14 years later.
Do we know that this is actually a woman?
No, we don't. I mean,
Really?
we go. I mean, some people might be watching this just inherently and going, "It's a guy." Like you look at this and you think it's always. I mean, on the internet, it always seems to be some man
guy in
behind
the
it,
basement
right?
somewhere.
It's that stereotype, but it's a
Yeah.
stereotype in a way for a reason, I think.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, what's interesting and what we find out in the film is sort of what led this person there. What they were doing when they weren't involved in this world of tickling, and that's where things get a little crazier.
Now, here's a question I have: is how bad has this affected, let's say, the victims? I mean, when you talk about they're getting harassed and they're getting, things are happening to them at school and things like that. How bad has their lives been affected by this?
Well, it sounds silly because it's a tickling video, right? How bad can this be? But the absolute intensity of the harassment is just, it's hard to describe unless you've sort of been through it. But, these people are suddenly finding that, you Google their name and you get nothing but this person is a perverted tickle freak. And, they're being doxxed, all their personal information is online, they're losing jobs. And a lot of these young men, they are from certain parts of America and the world where it's frowned upon to be in an all-male tickling video, and they're from conservative families, and suddenly this video, it's not set out to be pornographic, but it almost ends up being framed in that way. Yeah. And suddenly they're losing jobs. There's nothing they can do. There's a faceless person behind it. And online bullying is obviously this huge problem at the moment, but this is just this kind of really intense example of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, this is really, to me, it's a blackmail case, and it sort of fits into our weird, puritanical, obsession with, anything that involves human bodies doing anything together is somehow sexual, and it's freakish, and all of that. And I think what this documentary does is really kind of look at that as much as here's these people are using all of these weird homophobia and weird sex phobias that I feel like we all have, and using it to scare these people and to blackmail these people. What do you expect to be the kind of end result of this? I mean, do you think we'll see the end of Jane O'Brien media? Do you think we'll see? Yeah,
I mean, I've given up predicting where this goes. I mean, Dylan and I made the film because we saw, it seemed like there was an injustice going on. These people had nowhere to turn. They were being harassed. Nothing was being done about it. They went to the police. What can the police do? So we figured if we make a film, then it shines light on it. I don't know what will happen from here. There's a lot of things going on beyond the tickling that are, I think, potentially somewhat dodgy legally. And, we figure we'll put the film out. It'll act as a warning to people. Hopefully it'll make people think a little bit about before they engage with anyone on the internet.
Yeah.
In a certain way.
I think it is that good message that way.
Completely.
That you have to always be careful what you do on the internet, who you interact with, and where it could go.
And that sounds really obvious, and, internet natives have grown up with it. Obviously not everyone is who they, say they are. But you can still get tricked, even if you're completely savvy and you're aware of that, something can still come along that completely sidewinds you.
That's really interesting.
It's amazing. And I think we all kind of know, those of us who grew up in the dawn of the internet, we learned so early, once it's on the internet, it's there forever.
It's there
if
for
you
life.
put it there, everyone's going to see it. Assume that whatever goes on the internet is your priest is going to see it, your mother's going to see it, everyone's going to see it. And I think we kind of forgot about that for a while, and now we're going back to that. Oh, right, I forgot.
Completely. Oh, no, exactly. Yeah. Because you get used to that, and it's living is with us all the time now. But, you know, that can come back to get you.
Oh, yeah. Well, David, I got to say thank you so much for coming on, and fascinating film. People definitely got to go check it out. Thank you so much for coming.
No, it's so nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank
Great
you
stuff.
so much.
Great stuff.
Ronald Reagan once referred to the McLaughlin Group as having taken the idea of a Sunday morning talk show and turned it into a, quote, political version of Animal House. For decades, the syndicated political talk show's opening voiceover said it was the sharpest minds, best sources, and hardest talk. And hard it was, pitting liberals against conservatives, training a generation of pundits in the art of spirited, sometimes sensationalist, debate. For over 30 years, the McLaughlin Group was a place where the opinions of politicians weren't nearly as important as the journalists who covered them. And at its core was the only man whose opinion mattered, John McLaughlin, who passed away this week at the age of 89. In the 34 years the show was on the air, John McLaughlin only missed one episode, the one before his passing. But many didn't know there was more to this icon of opinion news than the parody made famous by Saturday Night Live skits. John McLaughlin was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1927 to a second-generation Irish Catholic family. He entered the Jesuit Order of the Catholic Church in 1947 and was ordained as a priest in 1949. McLaughlin went on to earn 2 master's degrees from Boston College and a PhD in philosophy from Columbia University. But the allure of politics led him to run for a Rhode Island Senate seat, which he lost, but which led him to a job as a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. Following Nixon's resignation in 1974, McLaughlin left the Jesuit order, got married, and went into public relations. Oh no. That's when, in 1982, the McLaughlin Group premiered. With his loud, brash, and forceful style, fans loved everything about the debates between 2 liberals and 2 conservatives, John in the middle, egging them on. Critics denounced the show as old white men arguing about things they didn't really know much about. And while many still contend that the McLaughlin Group is an example of what is wrong with political punditry, the late, great John McLaughlin was a bit of a soothsayer. Sometimes in order to make people listen, you have to yell, be loud, be unlikable. Great teachers don't always come in gentle packages. Sometimes the greatest teachers are willing to use force and showbiz to get through our thick skulls. The McLaughlin Group will end now that John is gone. A relic of time when people screaming on television actually said something of value. Let us remember the late, great John McLaughlin, who said, quote, "The acquisition of knowledge need not be like listening to a Gregorian chant." Thank you, John, for making us listen a little harder, fight a little harder, and never, ever stop doing what we love. And I'll leave you with his famous ending words. Out of time. Bye-bye.
John McLaughlin, a legend in the cable news industry for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely kind of the godfather of all pundit talk shows. Easy to say. You know, a lot of yelling and oh my gosh, you know, how could you say that and all of that. I think
Bill O'Reilly's Godfather.
Yeah. You know, I think all those shows, including even ours truly, is all kind of descendant of the McLaughlin Group.
I remember watching it. It was one of the first news programs on Sundays that I ever watched. Probably when I was about 6 years old when it first came on.
Fascinating bit of history. Fascinating bit of history. But as it is, out of here, bye-bye, and that is what we have to say right now. That is our show for you today. Remember, everyone in this world, we are not told we are loved enough. So I tell you all, I love you. I am